The modern world feels intangible, driven by code, capital, and invisible systems. But beneath that illusion lies something raw, physical, and unavoidable. Oil, not just as fuel, not just as gasoline at the pump, but as feedstock, material, lubricant, fertilizer input, transport backbone, and chemical foundation. We like to imagine modern prosperity as the triumph of intelligence over limitation, as if innovation alone built the world we live in. But much of what we call normal life was made possible by one hidden bargain. Energy stayed cheap enough to let everything else expand. Cities spread outward. Supply chains stretched across oceans. Food became industrial. Plastics became disposable. Debt became easier to sustain. Convenience multiplied. And because the bargain held for long enough, most people stopped seeing it altogether. That is the danger. The system works so smoothly in periods of stable energy that it starts to look self-sustaining. It is not. It is fueled. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. If you want to understand how the global economy really works, start with this uncomfortable truth. Modern abundance was not built on finance alone, or technology alone, or trade alone. It was built on concentrated energy, cheap enough and reliable enough to make complexity feel normal. That is the hidden bargain. And once you really see it, entire parts of modern life begin to look different. The supermarket is not just a retail achievement. It is refrigerated logistics, diesel transport, petrochemical packaging, fertilizer-intensive farming, and global distribution compressed into a single pleasant area. Fast fashion is not just clever branding and low labor costs. It is synthetic fibers, shipping fuel, industrial dyes, plastics, chemical processing, and a supply chain long enough to cross continents without collapsing. Suburbia is not just a cultural choice. It is an energy choice. Asphalt roads, cement, cars, commuting plastics, insulation, air conditioning, and endless movement made affordable by a world where fuel was expected to remain available and reasonably cheap. Even the things people rarely associate with oil are often entangled with it. Textiles, detergents, solvents, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, paints, synthetic rubber, industrial lubricants, pesticides, and the petrochemicals that quietly sit inside modern manufacturing. Oil does not just power the system, it helps make the system. That is why this story matters. Because societies become most fragile around the dependencies they stop noticing. For most of human history, energy constraints were obvious. Human labor was limited. Animal power was limited. Wood had limits. Wind and water were geographically inconsistent. Distance was expensive. Transport was slow. And every economic system lived closer to the edge of physical reality. Before fossil fuels, growth had a leash on it. A city could expand, but only so far before food, fuel, transport, and waste began fighting back. Production could increase, but not infinitely. Trade existed, sometimes at astonishing scale, but moving bulk goods remained physically costly and slow. The economy was always negotiating with muscle, weather, and geography. Then coal began to break that old ceiling in Britain and then across the industrial world. Coal-powered steam engines, railways, factories, and furnaces. It transformed manufacturing and movement. It allowed societies to do more work with fewer traditional constraints. But coal had limits too. It was powerful but dirty, bulky, and less flexible for the forms of mobility that would define the 20th century. That is where oil changed the story. Oil was energy-dense, transportable, and adaptable. It fit engines, ships, trucks, aircraft, mechanized agriculture, and military logistics. You could move with the system rather than anchoring the system in one place. That mattered more than almost any political speech or financial innovation of the last century. By the early 20th century, oil was no longer just another resource. It was becoming the bloodstream of industrial mobility. The internal combustion engine gave it reach. The automobile gave it scale. War gave it strategic importance. The First World War made clear that mechanized armies and navies depended on fuel. The Second World War removed any remaining ambiguity. Oil was not a luxury input. It was now a condition of military power, industrial movement, and national survival. And when the war ended in 1945, the victors did not build the post-war world around thrift or local self-sufficiency. They built it around expansion. This is where the hidden bargain becomes truly global. The post-war boom in the United States and much of the Western world was not just a triumph of democratic capitalism or good policy design. Though those stories are usually the ones told in textbooks, it was also a triumph of cheap fuel. Highways spread, cars became normal, suburbs multiplied, air travel expanded, consumer goods proliferated. Container shipping later made long-distance trade dramatically cheaper. Farming became more industrial, more mechanized, more fertilizer dependent, and more productive. Petrochemicals expanded into plastics, packaging, synthetics, and industrial materials. Cheap energy turned distance into a rounding error. Once that happened, the economy could sprawl. And once the economy sprawled, the financial system learned to love it. This is the part people often miss. Cheap energy did not simply help households and factories. It made the entire architecture of modern finance look smarter than it really was. When transport is cheap, companies can stretch supply chains across oceans and still protect margins. When energy is stable, consumer prices remain easier to manage. When production and distribution are efficient, central banks can appear more competent, corporations can lever up more comfortably, governments can promise steady growth, and asset markets can price the future as if friction itself had been abolished. Cheap energy is one of the greatest hidden subsidies in financial history. It made globalization cheaper, debt safer, and policy mistakes easier to survive. A lot of what looked like brilliant economic design was partly a gift from energy abundance. It also created a dangerous illusion, the illusion of efficiency. We were told the modern global economy had become leaner, smarter, more optimized. Inventory could be minimized. Production could be offshored. Goods could be made wherever labor was cheapest, components sourced wherever specialization was strongest, and everything could arrive almost exactly when needed. Just in time, logistics became a symbol of managerial sophistication. But systems that look efficient under stable conditions often reveal themselves as fragile under stress. If a product depends on ships crossing choke points, diesel-moving trucks, petrochemical inputs arriving on time, and energy prices staying moderate enough for every stage of production to make sense, then what appears efficient may actually be dependence with good branding. That is the real architecture of the modern world. It did not eliminate physical limits. It disguised them. It outsourced them to fuel long-distance logistics, strategic sea lanes, and the assumption that nothing critical would break. As long as oil was cheap and stable, the model looked elegant. Once that bargain weakened, elegance started looking suspiciously like denial. History gave us several warnings. The most famous came in 1973. The Arab oil embargo did not just raise prices. It exposed the extent to which rich industrial economies had reorganized daily life around affordable petroleum. Fuel shortages, long lines, inflation, slowing growth, political panic. These were not the effects of a mere commodity fluctuation. They were the effects of a foundational input becoming unstable inside a system built to assume the opposite. Then 1979 delivered the lesson again through the Iranian Revolution. Different trigger, same rule. When energy becomes scarce or even convincingly threatened, the prices of movement, production, and survival begin to rise together. The problem is never just the barrel. The problem is the dependency. The barrel reveals that pattern never really disappeared. It resurfaced in different forms. The Gulf crisis in 1990, the commodity surge before 2008, the energy shock after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the recurring fear around strategic choke points in Middle Eastern instability today. Every time the same basic truth emerges. The global economy still reacts violently because the global economy is still deeply physical. We talk like we live in a digital era, but the physical economy keeps sending the invoice. It is not just fuel, This is where the dependency gets even deeper than most viewers expect. Oil and gas do not merely sit in transport tanks and heating systems. They sit inside fertilizers that help sustain industrial agriculture. They sit inside the petrochemical chains that create plastics, packaging, and synthetic materials. They sit inside the fibers of polyester clothing, the compounds and detergents, the feedstocks of countless chemicals, the sealants, coatings, solvents, and industrial materials embedded in construction and manufacturing. Asphalt roads, plastic piping, synthetic insulation, medical equipment, industrial lubricants, and vast portions of modern material culture all rely on hydrocarbons somewhere in the chain. Once you see that, the phrase energy transition starts sounding less like a switch and more like a civilizational renovation. That does not mean transition is impossible. It means the old system is more deeply wired into daily life than many people want to admit. A society can electrify parts of transport, expand renewables, improve efficiency, and diversify its energy mix. Those things matter. But the old bargain still matters too, because the current global order remains heavily dependent on cheap and stable energy flows. Aviation still needs fuel. Shipping still runs through fuel. Petrochemicals still matter. Industrial agriculture still leans on energy-intensive inputs. Geopolitics still revolves around resource control, choke points, pipelines, shipping lanes, and supply disruption. The language may be greener now. The structure remains stubbornly physical. And that brings us to the present. One of the most important geopolitical realities of our time is that energy security has returned to the center of strategy. Whether politicians say so plainly or not, nations now speak more openly about resilience, critical supply chains, domestic capacity, industrial policy, and the vulnerability of relying on unstable or rival-controlled systems. They're doing that because history has returned. When energy flows are threatened, inflation rises, governments panic, and the comfortable assumption that markets can smooth over everything starts to break down. Central banks can raise rates, but they cannot drill oil. Finance ministries can subsidize households, but they cannot repeal physical scarcity. A spreadsheet can price a shortage. It cannot solve one. This is why cheap energy shaped more than economics. It shaped expectations. It trained populations to expect mobility, convenience, low-cost goods, warm homes, stocked shelves, and food systems so efficient they barely had to think about where anything came from. It trained political leaders to make promises based on continued abundance. It trained corporations to design business models around distance, leverage, and speed. It trained markets to treat smooth logistics and manageable inflation as normal states of being. And when that energy bargain weakens, everything downstream begins renegotiating what normal actually costs. That is the deeper lesson. The most dangerous thing about cheap energy is not that it runs out tomorrow. It is that it teaches societies to confuse temporary abundance with permanent reality. When a foundational input stays affordable for long enough, people stop seeing it as strategic. They stop noticing the bargain. Complexity expands. Dependency deepens. Promises grow larger. Then one disruption arrives. A war, an embargo, a choke point scare, a price spike, and the illusion disappears all at once. Suddenly, the system is not just expensive, it is exposed. So when people talk about the modern economy as if it were powered mainly by finance, software, or policy sophistication, remember what sits underneath. Remember the roads, the trucks, the shipping lanes, the refineries, the fertilizers, the plastics, the feedstocks, the machinery, the flights, the supply chains, the synthetic materials, and the physical movement behind almost every comfortable abstraction in modern life. The global system built on cheap energy did not just create wealth. It created an entire civilization of expectations, speed, scale, convenience, abundance, and growth, all resting on a foundation so powerful it became invisible until it doesn't. And when that hidden bargain starts to crack, the world does not simply get more expensive. It gets more honest. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. If this changed how you see the world, subscribe. Because once you understand the past, you start seeing the cracks in the future.